of, I just want to give a quick overview of the project, part of which you're going to see presented today. Lolly, why don't we move to the next slide? I think you're controlling the slides. I'm not sure about that. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to give a quick overview, and then we're going to turn it over to CJ and Greg to present their work, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So why don't we move to the next slide? So we're very honored and really appreciate the opportunity to have been able to do this research, and are delighted to be crossing the finish line on all of the major components that we aimed to complete. And I want to just give you a quick overview of what those are, and say, kind of in anticipation, that we want to be a resource to you within various state agencies, and we are continuing to work in these areas. UCLA is blessed to have at least 9, maybe 10 faculty right now who work on various climate impacts, climate adaptation, climate policy, and economics as it pertains to climate risks. And so we are kind of a resource, and as a public research university, we see it as part of our mission to be available and to work on problems that are of importance to the state. And in this particular grant, you can see the co-PIs listed there at the top and the contributors. I'll just briefly mention some of the other work that's being done. So Ji-Sung Park is leading a study to look at how heat has impacted workplace injury rates and fatalities. And he will present later. I don't want to steal his thunder, except to say he is finding that many accidents have been misclassified as non-heat related, but are highly correlated and probably caused by heat exposure, because they impact cognitive ability, the ability to focus attention, things like that. And so I think that's going to be a very important study. We also have Dr. Alan Barreca in the room today. He's done a lot of work on the impacts of heat on gestation and the risk of early delivery of children and the health impacts that has associated with it. And then both Ji-Sung Park and Alan Barreca, and also Greg Pierce, who's going to present in just a moment, have all in various ways worked on the impacts of heat, which of course require greater expenditures to cool one's home in the context of extreme heat exposure. That leads to often to financial delinquency, non-payment, and that in turn leads to energy debt and the risk of disconnection. And that may also impact an individual's creditworthiness. And so they will present later on some, I think, very interesting work that begins to show the role that heat plays in both energy debt, delinquency, and disconnection risks, which I know is a very important subject across the state, but especially at the CPUC. And then today, we're gonna hear the results of work around subsidized and manufactured housing with respect to both heat and wildfire risk. And then Lolly Lim and I have been leading work that looks at the current policy frameworks and governance capacity across state agencies when it comes specifically to developing resilience to heat exposure. And so we've assessed the capacity and the programmatic responsiveness of existing programs and policies to heat risks, and sort of evaluated gaps and opportunities for improving that governance capacity at a statewide level. And we'll be releasing that work in about a month, but we'll present on it very shortly. And then in support of quite a bit of this work, and also to give local city and county and then regional agencies the ability to undertake their own vulnerability analysis so they can target investments towards the vulnerable populations that they serve, whether it's seniors, workers, students, early childhood settings, prisons. We have, under Lali's leadership, developed a extreme heat edition for the Healthy Places Index, which is a little bit more spatially resolved and flexible than some of the other heat tools that are out there. And so this work has been funded by the Strategic Growth Council. We have endeavored wherever we can to partner with and consult with state agencies, and we hope to be able to continue to do that. If you have research needs or questions, please do reach out to any of the researchers that I've mentioned today. We really would like to be of service. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters today. Why don't you guys briefly introduce yourselves before you jump in?
Thanks, JR. This is Greg Pierce from UCLA, Associate Director at the Luskin Center at UCLA, faculty in urban planning and affiliated with the Institute of the Environment and School of Public Health, also at UCLA. CJ, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm CJ Gaby. I'm on the faculty at Santa Clara University in Environmental Studies and Sciences, and I'm affiliated faculty with the Luskin Center. And yeah, Greg's going to kick off the first part, and then I will pop in here in a little bit.
Thanks, CJ. So as JR mentioned, there will be follow-up presentations focusing on some of the other aspects, or all the other aspects of our broader project on both Wednesday and Thursday. But today's presentation and discussion is really going to focus on the work that CJ and I have been undertaking on the climate hazards of extreme heat and wildfires and their impact on subsidized and otherwise affordable housing in California. So we'll present a series of papers that have been both published and then in progress this work, but we're really focusing today's discussion and our research on subsidized housing, where 12% of the state's rental households live, as well as manufactured housing, where over 3% of California households live, really for two different reasons. The first is a general lack of focus to date among researchers on sort of the mediating role of housing and housing quality, housing location on sort of exposure and adaptive capacity to extreme heat and wildfires, as well as some of these types of housing sort of being a durable indicator of lower income and otherwise vulnerable household locations in California looking into the future. Next slide. So we're going to run through, again, several studies that have been published, as well as two that are under peer review, as well as some other projects that have started or been inspired by the research or by the funding directly provided from the Strategic Growth Council. So we're going to particularly focus on two papers that have been published in Housing Policy Debate and Environmental Management, as well as one that is near publication at a journal focused on heat planning. Next slide. And in a minute here, I'm going to turn the floor back over to CJ. And back to Leia's original comment, the way we like this to work is that each of these three sort of modules would be presented discretely, and then we'd have time for Q&A in between, as well as Q&A or discussion from all of you at the end of our presentation. But we're going to start with a focus on heat vulnerability in housing, and then transition over to local planning and sort of adaptive capacity efforts at the city level for heat, and then close with the focus on wildfire hazards in housing. But with that, I want to turn the floor back over to CJ to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. Yeah, and thanks to everyone for coming today. It's great to see all of your interest in these topics. And, we're very indebted to SGC's funding, but also to so many other agency staff and your help providing data sources that we'll walk through as we go. Everything from data from CAL FIRE, the OPR survey, housing data from HCD and SGC. And you'll see as we go that these research projects really hinge on state data. So next slide, please. So the first paper that I want to present, and just going to breeze through this because I want us to have plenty of time for questions and for discussion. We looked at how residents of subsidized housing and manufactured housing in California might be associated with vulnerability to extreme heat, and looking at how these housing types residents of these housing types may be more vulnerable than residents of other housing types, like owner-occupied housing and rental housing. So we know a few things from the literature and past research in terms of individual sensitivity to heat. What are some of the factors that affect how well we can adapt to extreme heat events? And we have really set this up with a conceptual model that vulnerability to extreme heat is really a function of our exposure to heat indoors and outdoors, how sensitive we may be to that heat, factors like age and underlying health conditions, and how well we can adapt to that heat too. And surprisingly, there's been very little research, particularly on housing types and subsidized housing in particular, about how these housing types overlap with heat vulnerability. Next slide, please. So this is a very high-level exploratory analysis where we took 3 sets of tract level data, where we created 3 sets of tract level data focused on housing. So we were looking at whether housing was owner-occupied or renter-occupied, the type of housing that it was, whether it was subsidized by various state and federal subsidy programs. And we also have a separate paper, which is in peer review that Greg mentioned, that's focused specifically on manufactured housing and mobile home parks. So we're looking at the tract level at some housing data sources. Then we're looking at future projected extreme heat. So looking at the tracts that are going to have the most extreme heat days as defined in terms of the 98th percentile of historical averages. And then we created a social vulnerability index that we're calling the Adaptive Capacity and Sensitivity Index. And this is essentially an index that represents how sensitive the residents of a census tract are, and or how many challenges they may have in terms of adaptive capacity. Next slide, please. So we really started focusing on tracts that were going to be the hottest in the future. So these are what we call the high heat tracts. That's the top quartile of tracts. Then we look at tracts that are challenged in terms of sensitivity or adaptive capacity. So we call these the high ACSI tracts. And then where these two things overlap, heat and social vulnerability, this is what we call the high tracts. So as I get into the next few slides, you can remember that high is kind of this intersection. Do you mind going back one real quick? Thanks. High is going to be the intersection of the hottest tracts and the most socially vulnerable tracts. Next slide, please. So first, looking at what types of housing tend to be in the highest heat tracts. And we know that heat isn't evenly distributed across the state. We know it's interesting because owner-occupied housing is a little bit more likely to be in these tracts than the renter-occupied housing. In terms of most of the subsidized housing types, they are pretty close to the typical renter-occupied housing. Next slide, please. So we can see that the high heat tracts and the housing, subsidized housing that are within these tracts tend to be in the Central Valley and the Inland Empire, eastern parts of Los Angeles County. So we have this kind of geographic spine of the hottest parts of California. We're pretty accustomed to this. Next slide, please. Then we have some really stark differences when we look at high ACSI tracts. So these are the tracts that have the most social vulnerability. We can see that here, public housing, housing choice vouchers, low-income housing tax credits, affordable housing and sustainable communities, subsidized units, all of these are much more likely than typical renter-occupied housing units to be in these high social vulnerability, high ACSI tracts. Next slide, please. And we also know that there are negative associations between several types of affordable housing and the amount of tree canopy. And we know that there are positive associations between several types of affordable housing and how much impervious surface and pavement. And this really fits into the literature where we know that certain neighborhoods have much fewer trees and much more pavement. Next slide, please. So when we put it all together and we look at these housing units that are in high tracts, And just keeping in mind that about 7% of owner-occupied and 8% of renter-occupied housing units are in these tracts. We have larger shares of all of the affordable housing types in these tracts. So I'll talk about it here in a second, but we start to see this picture emerging where subsidized and affordable housing units tend to be in tracts at the intersection of heat and social vulnerability more often than typical rental or owner-occupied housing. Next slide, please. And the map of where this occurs mostly, but doesn't completely overlap with the high heat tracts. You can see, for instance, some of the differences up in the Sacramento area, in eastern Los Angeles County. So we start to see this kind of second map of places where there's the most social vulnerability in housing and the hottest parts of the state. Next slide, please. This situation is even more stark for manufactured housing units. Remembering that 25% of all housing units are in these high heat tracts, 43% of manufactured housing units are in these tracts. Remembering that 8% of all housing were in the high tracts, 17% of manufactured housing is in the high tracts, which is higher than any of the subsidized housing types that we looked at in the other study. Next slide, please. So our research, and I saw the comment in the chat, we'll be sure to share a version of this with you all if you're interested, is we start to show how there's this really, do you mind going back one slide? Oh, thanks. So there's kind of this disproportionate share of low income and particularly subsidized and manufactured housing residing Californians who live in high neighborhoods. And some of these adaptation challenges relate to tree canopy, some of them relate to impervious surfaces, some of them relate to higher shares of senior and residents, children, and next slide, please. And there are a few different policy approaches that can be used to offset these situations. Some of it may have to do with the siting and design, thinking about within a region and between regions where affordable housing is sited and approved, how the design of that housing is implemented, thinking about how climate hazards may be an increasing way that we can decide where and which projects to fund. And I wanted to point out, I have screenshots from the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities round 6 scoring criteria, where community climate resiliency, which includes extreme heat, is included as one of the criteria. But I think for local governments in particular, we may think about opportunities to make investments in high neighborhoods. And some of these investments may be associated with deep paving, tree canopy, air conditioning provision, utility assistance. We can think about how this high neighborhood characterization can help us to think about where to invest. Next slide, please. So Greg and I and some others are carrying this forward. This is all kind of a high-level tract level analysis with more detailed household and parcel scale analyses. We're also thinking about ways in which affordable housing funding programs can reduce heat vulnerability and doing an assessment of what other states are doing, how other funders are thinking about these issues. And then, we focused on housing policy. I think there's an important gap in terms of the tens of thousands of unhoused Californians and their exposure and vulnerability to extreme heat as well. Next slide, please.
So I think we want to pause here for any questions or discussion. And again, we can return to this topic at the end.
And feel free to drop questions or thoughts in the chat too. We can respond to them.
Yeah, and also, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, we'll give people a minute here. Go ahead, Leah.
I was just gonna say, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you had a clarifying question at this point.
Hi, this is Sarah Partiglio from CARB. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand, but you said jump in, so I am. I was just wondering, I mean, obviously, I know you're aware that there are many weatherization assistance programs at the state and federal level, and I'm just wondering how you're going to get this information to them to inform the funding. Will it be included in things like CalEnviroScreen? I just don't know how to like operationalize this information.
Yeah, maybe that's a great question. Thanks for that. Maybe actually Lolly might talk a little bit about briefly the heat tool and the policy gap analysis. I think some of this might be, if not this exact index, the concepts that we're studying here are some of the things that JR and Lolly were mentioning in terms of those tools.
Sorry, I just needed to figure out how to unmute myself. So so we do have a tool that we will be sharing on Thursday that outlines some of these, has some of these similar data sets of anticipated exposure, heat exposure and projected heat exposure, as well as some of these underlying housing conditions. In terms of operationalizing how this can be integrated into actual programs, I think that's a conversation that is probably needs to be ongoing, perhaps in collaboration with CSD that implements LIWIP and other weatherization programs, in terms of areas that where more attention for weatherization is necessary. But yeah, I think from our perspective, we haven't necessarily made that we haven't quite gotten there yet in terms of translating this into next step actions to inform specific programs.
Yeah, I mean, we have been in touch with CSD over the life of the project and certainly continue to be involved in weatherization sort of utility level energy savings program. So I think all of this informs, well, yeah, we will be back in touch with CSD, who I don't think is on the call today. They may be on calls Wednesday or Thursday, but also informs our work with utilities and with regulators in those spaces. But if you have other sort of programs you're thinking of beyond sort of the CSD and other agencies who are on this call's remit that you think we should be communicating this research out to, we welcome that as well.
I have a question I'm 95% sure I know the answer to, but I want to ask for clarity. It's a small question. The data you used, was it from the LOCA downscaled work done for the state's fourth climate change assessment, and or did you supplement with any local, maybe even more localized or regional studies that had been done in certain places?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's what we had used, the LOCA downscaled results and the state's four priority climate models.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Sure.
Sarah, I thought I saw you unmute again, but I could be wrong.
No, but I did see that Jinhook from CARB is on the line as well. I was wondering if there are any like synergies between the CARB grant funding program for clean air shelters. Maybe there would be some like prioritization for people who also needed shelter from the heat as well as smoke. But
so Sarah, thank you for pointing me out. So for the grant program for wildfire smoke, the pilot program is not geared toward, give out, incentivize the individual housing, but provide some public facilities like the libraries and community centers and probably county fairgrounds kind of facility, to upgrade their ventilation systems to operate them as clean air centers for wildfire smoke events or other types of smoke events. So we could see some collaboration in a sense to find where those clean air centers could be located out of this kind of research. So yeah, that I see some linkage there, but in terms of direct support to the individual, the housing or the buildings, the grant program may not be that helpful.
Other questions on this one or thoughts?
Yeah, this is Emma from CARB. I've seen some interesting sociology research talking about social infrastructure and support networks as a really key resilience factor. And I'm just curious to what extent that figured into this adaptive capacity analysis.
Yeah, that's a great question. Those some of those kind of social capital, social connections within a community, which I think are absolutely important in seeing who has worse health outcomes from heat. Those we were using mostly census and state data at the census tract level, so we haven't incorporated that. But I think those are the sorts of things that we're going to be able to look at more when we get into the more detailed household level analyses, when we use some qualitative methods along with this. But I think it's absolutely an important point is to understand how social connectivity may really shape health outcomes here too. All right, well, we can also, if you have a burning question for that other first paper, we can also address it at the end as well. Let me talk a little bit about local planning for heat. And some of our interest in this has come about because many planners, both in practice and in scholarship, housing policy folks, haven't traditionally thought of heat as part of their purview. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, we wanted to answer two questions, thinking about, what are some of the factors that influence whether California municipalities adopt policies and plans for climate adaptation generally and urban heat more specifically, and then doing a deeper dive into the content of some California plans. What are the types of policies that they most commonly adopt to plan for extreme heat? Next slide, please. So we know that cities have been doing much more work around climate mitigation than adaptation. And there are a few local characteristics that have been associated with adaptation, including population, planning staff and resources, political capital, and also the degree to which a city or county may feel that they have threats from climate change too. Some of the most politically feasible strategies tend to be ones that produce co-benefits as well. But like I was saying a second ago, there tends to be this kind of siloed heat policy approach, and planners may be focused on some of the built environment approaches, and then there's this kind of emergency management, risk management silo that is kind of working on a separate track, although trying to solve some of the same problems. So we don't know that much about just broadly what types of urban heat strategies are cities adopting and why. Next slide, please. So we were able to really leverage OPR's 2018 survey, where OPR asked additional questions about climate change and what cities were doing in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And there were a few questions that the survey included that were really helpful to our research, and they make up the first part of our study. And so this is whether cities have adopted any climate adaptation strategies, whether they've included climate adaptation in their general plan, and whether they have adopted any kinds of urban heat island policies. And then we set up a series of regression models where we tried to understand what were some of the determinants of whether a city had any adaptation strategies, whether they had done it in their general plan or urban heat island. And some of those potential determinants were things like how much capacity did they have in the local government, what were some of their community interests and structure, how much environmental risk did they face, have they done other types of environmental justice planning, what types of intergovernmental structures are they part of, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So just looking descriptively, the majority of cities in California had some kind of adaptation plans or strategies, but most did not have it in their general plans, at least at the time of the 2018 survey. And about 37% had some type of urban heat island policy self-reported. Next slide, please. So looking at the regression results, we first started thinking about what is the role of extreme heat in spurring a city to do adaptation planning and specifically planning for urban heat island policies. So as you can imagine, the cities that had the most projected extreme heat in the 2040s were also the cities that were more likely to have urban heat island policies. We didn't find any statistical associations between heat and just adaptation planning generally or in general plans. We found a few things that helped us to understand some of this landscape of what cities were planning and which weren't. Cities that had larger shares of Hispanic or Latino residents were less likely to have adaptation in their in general or urban heat island policies. Found cities that had more leadership support, so some kind of the political side of climate adaptation were more likely to have adaptation planning, more likely to have urban heat island policies, but no clear results in terms of larger cities were more likely to be doing adaptation than smaller ones. There wasn't the result that richer cities were more likely to be doing adaptation than lower income cities. So those were actually a little bit contrary to what we had seen nationally. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to understand some of these factors, particularly the question of what cities were doing. And so we zoomed in on the 6 largest cities in California, so LA, San Diego, San Jose, San Francisco, Fresno, and Sacramento. And then we looked at 4 types of plans that they had that might have something related to extreme heat. So this is where we kind of took it from this broad statewide regression analysis into the details of the plans. And so we looked at general plans, climate action plans, climate adaptation plans, and then local hazard mitigation plans. So for each of these 6 cities, we looked at 4 types of plans. And then we had a set of criteria that we had multiple coders going through each plan, looking for incidences of these criteria. So, everything from, did the plans identify extreme heat as an issue? Did they present data about the nature of the issue? Did they include urban heat management strategies? Everything from, cool roofs and green roofs to urban tree canopy to green infrastructure. Did they include things related to emergency management and heat wave response planning, cooling centers, early warning systems for heat events, heat response plans, these sorts of things. So we had multiple coders going through these plans looking for these criteria. Next slide, please. And so what we found was that there was a lot of variation in what was included generally and then by plan type. So these are sorted, these are all of the criteria that you saw in that previous slide. These are sorted from most prevalent to least prevalent across plans. So most prevalent was seeing heat identified as an issue across plans. Urban tree canopy, extremely prevalent across all 4 types of plans, vegetative cover generally. And then we start to see some of the types of interventions that are much more commonly mentioned in adaptation plans, not so much in general plans, not so much in hazard mitigation plans, things like green roofs or even, cool pavements. It seems like climate adaptation plans were the type of plan where we saw the most varied number of different strategies that were addressed. And And then some strategies that we really didn't see in any or many plans, including cool walls, very little direct reference to waste heat emissions, those sorts of things. Next slide, please. So we know that California cities can do a lot more to plan for urban heat, either at general or a specific level. We think that political factors from our regression analysis and looking at how the cities are planning for urban heat are going to drive urban heat related policy adoption, particularly thinking about the types of policies that were included most commonly in plans tended to be ones that had the most co-benefits, things like expanding tree canopy, urban forestry programs, green infrastructure. We saw a lot of variation about how large cities addressed extreme heat, and that variation wasn't necessarily associated with how hot the cities were. For instance, San Francisco has probably the most robust set of strategies in the cities we looked at. And San Francisco wasn't the hottest city in our study area. And as we looked at the content of all these plans, we tried to look through them with a lens of thinking about how racial and economic justice were incorporated into the urban heat policy framing. We saw it's really rarely incorporated. There were sometimes mentions of vulnerable communities in general, but rarely talking about how communities of color or low-income communities might be specifically affected by heat inequities that we know more broadly. Next slide, please. So lots of opportunities to think about what are the ways that cities can better plan for heat, whether it's detailed guidelines at the state, federal levels, additional technical assistance and funding, particularly thinking about this issue of thermal inequity, which is a growing concern of many cities. And local governments, like many issues in planning, can think about how these ecosystems of plans relate to each other, ways in which they can be better coordinated, consistency can be ensured across plans. And then we saw very little about how they would be implemented, funded, or monitored. So those are going to be, like many things, important steps forward, thinking about reducing heat vulnerability from the municipal perspective. Next slide, please. So we're doing a number of research projects building off of this and just starting up. Expanded survey research, looking at how this compares to plan content nationally, thinking about what are some of the factors related to governance and implementation, and then looking, the Luskin Center is leading work looking at some of the capacities of and support needed for small municipalities, particularly in the LA area. Next slide, please. So what questions do you all have about this? Reactions, thoughts, things you're wondering about? And the chat's great too, if you want to drop us a line in there too.
I'll ask a question. I'm wondering if in any of these local plans you saw evidence of consideration of linkages between transportation and land use and intentional aims to reduce vehicle miles traveled, reduce pervious or impervious surfaces, anything of that nature.
Definitely. I mean, especially in the general plans and the climate action plans, like you're saying, the VMT reduction, all of those, were pretty common. Much less common was connecting it in any explicit way with heat. So that, that's one thing to think about. Even many of the references to tree canopies might have either vaguely, mentioned heat, or in many cases not at all. So some of these things, may be non-existent in plans. Some of these things may be occurring in plans and have heat benefits, but really, aren't being explicitly tied to heat. So that's a great question. But I think general plans and the climate adaptation plans seem to be the places where we saw the most of those explicit mentions between some of these things and heat.
Hi, this is Helen. I had another quick set of questions. My first question is, of the cities that were lacking in adaptation policies, especially those majority Hispanic populations, parts of the state were those concentrated in? And then my second question is just in terms of urban heat management and urban heat trade canopy, I noticed that bus shelters were not mentioned, and we know that the majority of people who take public transit are low-income workers in the service sector. So I'm wondering if the impacts of the people who take public transit and don't have access to bus shelters is also, evaluated and when we're talking about urban heat island effects.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'll start maybe with your second question. That isn't something that we included this time around, though I think that's something we should certainly follow up with in a revision to this paper or the next follow-on research to it, because I think we focus on some broader things, and I think the shading at bus shelters and urban shading more generally is an important one. So in terms of the parts of the state where the cities with larger shares of Hispanic or Latino residents were living that had no urban heat island policy self-reported, it was kind of all over, but I noted some that were Inland Empire, Imperial County. I can follow up and send a list. I know in our paper we highlighted about 7 or 10 cities in particular.
And I would just add on the outdoor shading and particularly bus stops, that is a focus of the LA project that I'm a part of, and Lolly is a part of it as well, along with a number of other UCLA researchers. So we'd be happy to follow up. And part of that focus there is based both on the work that CJ just presented, as well as the results of the statewide policy gap analysis. We really didn't find much around outdoor exposure interventions at all. So all that to say, we're working on that. We'd be happy to share more or be in touch with you if you have more specific questions on that topic.
Greg, you're referencing the other project we funded. Is that?
I'm actually referencing another project. So this LA focused project I'm referencing is not funded by SGC. There is another project that is funded by SGC, led by Kelly Turner, who's also a colleague at UCLA at the Luskin Center, which, yeah, I mean, Lolly can speak more to as well, although I'm not involved in that project. Lolly, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So for that other project, which is SGC CCRP round 3, led by Kelly Turner, it's a project that is focused in one particular community near the Salton Sea called Oasis, California. And as part of that, we'll be working with a small group of community leaders to both do some temperature measurements at their site and do some modeling to understand anticipated impacts on thermal comfort in future years. And as part of that, we're also working with a design firm to develop a prototype for shade structures based on community inputs for what would be helpful and site locations. So yeah, we'll be developing a prototype and installing that prototype sometime next spring. So we're working on that prototype, early stages of getting feedback and development this year through the end of the year.
Yes, that's exciting.
Helen, did that answer your question or?
Yeah, it did. It's
Okay.
exciting to hear about your other research projects. And I'd love to hear more about the 7 to 10 cities that you mentioned in your paper.
Great. Well, yeah, let's connect after then. Thank you. 2 questions came in the chat. One from Mark about heat exposure in cities and looking at cases of heat exhaustion or heat strokes. We didn't in this paper. I've started to, in some work looking at unhoused deaths in Santa Clara County, have looked at cases where those were either the primary cause or contributing cause were heat exhaustion. So that's certainly, an important area and something that we didn't include in these papers, but are thinking about how to do it looking forward. And then from Leah had a question about another question just came in here about how the treatment of extreme heat in plans compares to other climate impacts. That's a great question. We didn't look at that, and I hate to speculate just anecdotally, but it would be interesting to see how if we did a similar kind of content analysis and looked at sea level rise and wildfires and some other climate impacts, how these might compare or not. So that would be a great follow-on research question for sure.
And Eric, it looks like you're saying you're expecting that extreme heat might start getting added more frequently given changes made more frequently. I mean, sorry, more recently. You can't talk.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that, by the way, great findings. Thank you so much for sharing this. I think it does kind of align with the reality that, extreme heat hasn't been mentioned as a mandatory hazard addressed in California's mandatory planning requirements ever. In fact, it still is not mentioned in the upper part of the statute in terms of defining what natural hazards are even supposed to be analyzed. Because CalAdapt does introduce data on extreme heat, and because of the newer requirements in SB 379 and SB 1035, I think we can expect to see a level of change. But I think as your results and as our annual planning survey data suggests that there's still folks are a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of compliance with the new adaptation planning requirements, but we should see a growing number of jurisdictions starting to address the issue.
Thanks for that. We'd love to circle back with you and share, our paper with you too, if you'd be willing to provide some feedback on that as well.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I could, this is Juliet, if I could jump in. Yes, we have this gap in extreme heat, and we recognize that. And so as we're developing the update to the state adaptation strategy, we have a parallel process ongoing to revisit the state's work on extreme heat. And actually Taylor Carnevale has joined. She's leading the work for that in our office, but it's really a cross-agency effort. But a lot of what you have here would be really interesting to look at in more detail. So I don't know, I guess I had a timing question of when will this be available, or how can we think about incorporating, because we're hoping to develop this the extreme heat framework for the state, by end of year.
Yeah, it's in peer review right now. I mean, if it wasn't going to be circulated, I think we feel comfortable sharing it with you after the call, if that would be, and certainly as soon as it's accepted and toward publication, we'll have a published version. But I mean, for draft interim findings, I think the version under peer review might be useful, and we could follow up with a meeting or something. Thank you for that.
I think there's one more from Shep in the chat. Okay.
So does the research point to any thresholds for what level of adaptation would be required to move the needle or make a noticeable impact on an area's temperature? There are some scholars looking at these questions. This wasn't part of what we were looking at in terms of, looking at the amount of, trees that cities were aiming to plant. We weren't looking at, any types of quantified measures of depaving, that sort of thing. So yeah, I might, if you want to follow up offline, I might be able to point you toward some other scholarship on that. Certainly important as we think about some of these issues around governance, funding, implementation, monitoring, that sort of thing. So thank you.
Yeah, like CJ said, I'm aware of a study that does exactly that in LA County, that by colleagues, which I'm not involved in. So I'd also be happy to share that, but our work did not look at that yet.
So I think I'll hand it over to Greg to talk about wildfires.
Okay, so I'm going to be brief here because I know we have less than 30 minutes. I want to leave plenty of time for end question and answer, but take a little, I guess not detour, but we're going to focus here on our work on fire hazards and impacts on, again, subsidized and otherwise affordable housing, particularly manufactured housing. This work really, we expanded well beyond the original scope of the proposal because both because of its importance to the state, especially over the last few years and looking into the next few decades, as well as sort of the relationship between heat and fire and some of the planning processes that we're interested in working on. But our work, I should say here, is really focused on direct sort of impacts of fire, either in terms of property or human damage and associated sort of impacts on relocation, rather than wildfire smoke, which I know has come up several times today, and again, and air filtration, which are other concerns that we are working on along with colleagues. But a lot of our work was really inspired in the space, particularly by having a long history of working on environmental exposures and sort of essential service access among residents of mobile home parks, and seeing that the impact of fires, particularly looking at the 10 largest fires of the last 3-4 years in California, that a lot of the deaths and a large percentage of the property damage were concentrated in mobile home parks, such as the Seminole Springs Mobile Home Park and Agora Hills post the Woolsey fire. Next slide. And of course, I assume many of you, are aware of sort of the relationship between the California housing affordability crisis and wildfire risk, particularly the continuation and historical build out of housing in the so-called wildland urban interface, or the WUI, over the last few decades in California, that has sort of exacerbated the current problem we have with wildfire risk directly affecting housing in the state. Next slide. And we have one published paper in the space that, again, we could share with any of you right now, and then several other pieces of research that are ongoing or starting up. The piece that we have already published is really a parallel study to the one CJ first presented on, that looks at all the different types of subsidized housing in California, as well as manufactured housing and mobile home parks, and looks at where those locations are located inside and outside of the WUI. And we did also look, I should say, at CAL FIRE's sort of fire hazard severity planning measure as another measure of fire exposure, but ultimately settled on the WUI for this analysis. But here, I'll say that actually there's a positive story between prevalence of different housing types, subsidized housing types in the WUI, compared to the heat story, where pretty much every type of subsidized housing is less prevalent in the WUI compared to the general housing stock, with particularly notable small percentages of housing, for instance, in the AHSC program being located in the WUI. On the other hand, we found that manufactured housing is much more likely to be located in the WUI than other types of subsidized affordable housing in the general housing stock. Next slide. Another way of looking at this is looking at both sort of the number of subsidized units in the WUI per county, where we find the largest concentrations in, particularly in Southern California counties, the largest Southern California counties, including Los Angeles and San Diego, whereas the highest percentage of subsidized units within each county are pretty much exclusively concentrated along the eastern spine of California and far northern California. Next slide. Then again, as we've said, we do take a special look at manufactured housing, really building on a lot of work we've done on manufactured housing and mobile home parks. And actually, in the study that we currently have under review, it looks both at exposure to heat and wildfire hazards. And we find that households in manufactured housing in California face consistently higher exposure to heat and fire hazards, really using any exposure measure that was available. We did look at, I believe, 5 to 6 different exposure measures. Next slide. But you can see some of the results here when you're looking just at the percentage, again, the relative percentage of housing in the WUI. We find that rental manufactured housing is more than, or almost double, twice the prevalence of general rental housing, whereas owner occupied manufactured housing is has a higher prevalence in the WUI than general owner occupied housing, and mobile home park lots are about just as likely as all owner occupied housing to be located in the WUI. Next slide. And this is just another way of looking at the same data, which shows you the relative concentration of each housing type within WUI or wild and urban interface tracts. We find again that both renter and owner occupied manufactured housing is more likely to be located in the WUI than other types, or the same renter owner occupied housing that's not manufactured, as well as manufactured housing being much more likely to be concentrated in tracts that have historically experienced wildfire events than other types of housing within the renter or owner categories. Next slide. Then I want to turn just briefly to in-progress research and sort of future research that we've just started up or intend to undertake in this space. We, as part of the SUC grant, we have a policy brief that we don't feature here that looks at the connection between utility service and housing and exposure to heat and wildfire. And this has led us to a follow-on project with the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension, specifically focused on the relationship between wildfire and planning for water supply in California. And some of your agencies should be receiving invites for our convening on this, which is being taken place in late September. Next slide. And then, sorry, could you go back? Okay. Some other research that we have undertaken in the course of the grant from SDC is much broader, focused on historical housing growth and historical fire patterns in California, really looking over the period 1970 through 2010. What we found in looking at that relationship, and again, here we use different measures of fire, looking just at large fires, looking at all fires, looking at fires not just within a tract, but in surrounding tracts. Really, any way you look at the relationship, it appears that housing growth only increases after historical fire events. And this is particularly true among manufactured housing, where you see a boom in manufactured housing growth within certain neighborhoods where fire has occurred most recently. And even after controlling for sort of other factors that lead to housing market growth more generally, we see this relationship at a less strong relationship, but still a positive relationship between fire and housing growth, particularly manufactured housing growth. As I said, we conducted this research over the period 1970 through 2010, but we are actually looking to expand this research and deepen it by using data that's going to come out through 2020, as well as add additional sort of housing market growth variables to strengthen our analysis. So if you're interested in this topic and have thoughts or would like to see our preliminary research, we're also happy to share that with individuals who would like to engage. Next slide. And then last but not least, we have submitted one grant and are starting to do research and intend to focus much of our future research on the relationship between housing and fire, on adaptive capacity and on solutions to meeting this problem. In addition to problem identification, really looking at housing policies that influence the supply, siting, and preservation of existing housing, as well as land use planning around sort of defensible space, zoning, and urban design standards, and then building scale policies that can increase the fire resistance of the structure of housing itself that's in situ. Next slide. And of course, our work, we see policy implications around how state government influences both county and city general plans, as well as I just mentioned, local government zoning policies and housing approval patterns that we hope to influence and are engaged with policymakers on already. Next slide. Yeah, so with that, I want to conclude the formal presentation. We're happy to take questions on the firework I just presented or on anything else we presented today. But thanks for your time and